Welcome back to Moto Italia. Today we're diving into the electrical system. Time to untangle some classic Italian electrical spaghetti. Since the last episode, I've loosely routed the main wiring harness into place on the bike. Now it's time to start cleaning up the connectors before we make any final connections. I go through each plug one by one, inspect for corrosion or dirt, and clean them using contact cleaner. Good contact is crucial for Italian electrics. We don't want to chase gremlins later. I go through each connector one by one, spraying them with contact cleaner and letting it sit for about 5 minutes. Then I clean the contact surfaces and apply a thin layer of protective oil. Pay extra attention to the 2 connectors going to the ECU unit. These are a known trouble spot on these bikes, so a thorough cleaning here is especially important. After the cleaner has had time to work, I use compressed air to blow out the connectors. Then I apply a light layer of contact oil. This both neutralizes the cleaner and protects the surfaces from oxidation. Next up is the fuse box. I begin by installing the fuse box bracket using brand new stainless steel Allen bolts. Once the bracket is in place, I route the wiring harness correctly around it and then click the fuse box into position. With the fuse box mounted, I clean and plug in the connector for the rear light. We'll come back to the license plate light and turn signal connectors later. There's also a relay all the way at the back on the left side. This connector has already been cleaned, so I apply a small amount of acid-free grease before inserting the relay and seating it into its bracket. The fit wasn't quite tight enough for my taste, so I used a pair of needle-nose pliers to carefully tighten the spade terminals inside the connector for a better grip. Next up is wiring the aftermarket license plate light and rear turn signals. Since these aren't original parts, none of the connectors match the factory harness, so some custom work is required. To keep things tidy and serviceable, I'm not cutting into the original loom. Instead, I've cut the connectors off the original lights, and I'll now solder them onto the new LED units. I start by stripping all the wire ends and cleaning them with soldering flux before tinning each end with fresh solder. This ensures a clean and reliable joint. I also slide heat shrink tubing with adhesive lining onto one of the wire ends before soldering. It's important to check the polarity of the LED lights before making the final connections. If the polarity is reversed, they won't work at all. Once everything is soldered, I clean the joints thoroughly using alcohol to remove any remaining flux or grease. Then I slide the heat shrink tubing into place and use a heat gun to seal the connection. The heat activates the adhesive inside the tubing, creating a watertight and durable seal that should last for many years. Finally, I apply a small amount of acid-free dielectric grease to the connectors and plug them into the main harness. Next up is installing the relays on the right side of the bike. This area houses several important relays, and I've already cleaned all the connectors thoroughly earlier in the process, just like the rest. First, I mount the plastic bracket that holds the relays in place. Before installing the relays, I apply a small amount of acid-free dielectric grease to the terminals. This helps prevent corrosion and ensures solid electrical contact over time. Then I plug in each relay and carefully press them into their designated slots on the bracket. At the front edge of the bracket, there's a small channel where the wiring harness is routed. I secure it neatly in place using a plastic zip tie. Next up is plugging in the intake air temperature sensor, the one that monitors the temperature of the air entering the engine. It's located on top of the airbox, and with the wiring harness already routed, the connector is right where it needs to be. I simply plug it in, making sure the connection is firm and properly seated. Of course, I also apply a small dab of acid-free dielectric grease to protect the terminals from moisture and corrosion. Next up is plugging in the throttle position sensor, TPS, located on top of the throttle body on the right cylinder. With the wiring harness correctly routed, the connector lines up perfectly with the sensor. I plug it in, ensuring a solid connection. As always, I apply a small amount of acid-free dielectric grease to the terminals. Next up is connecting the engine temperature sensor and the idle control valve. The temperature sensor is located on the right cylinder and has a blue connector. I apply a small amount of acid-free dielectric grease to the terminals before plugging in the connector. The idle control valve sits between the throttle bodies. With the connector already routed correctly, I simply plug it in. And as always, make sure the connection is solid and protected with a dab of grease. Now I route the ground cable from the main harness, along with the lambda sensor connector, down past the left throttle body toward the starter motor. I bolt the ground wire securely in place. This is a critical connection for the entire electrical system. The lambda connector is left in position for now, ready to be plugged in later. Next up is the ignition switch. I'm going to open it up, clean, and inspect the internal components and apply fresh lubricant, just to make sure everything is functioning properly and well protected for the miles ahead. This preventative step is worth the effort, especially on older bikes, where grime and moisture can cause issues over time. Cue the Italian music. Let's dive into some satisfying switch maintenance.
Non più tra i farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girando, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Non più avrai questi bei panacchini, quel cappello leggero galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante, quel vermiglio d'onesco color, quel vermiglio d'onesco color. Non più avrai quei pennacchini, quel cappello, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante. Non chiudrai farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girando, delle belle turbando al riposo, ma ci settuatocino d'amor, delle belle tornando a riposo, ma ci settuatocino d'amor. Fra guerrieri può far pacco, gran bustacchi stretto sacco, schioppo in spalla, sciabla a fianco, collo dritto, muso franco, un gran casco, un gran turbante, molto onor, poco cantante, poco cantante, poco cantante. Ed invece del fandango una marcia per il fango, per montagne, per valloni, con le nevi e salioni, al concerto di tromboni, di bombarde e di cannoni, che le porre tutti i tuoni all'orecchio fan fischiar. Non più avrai quei pennacchini, non più avrai quel cappello, non più avrai quella chioma, non più avrai quell'aria brillante, non più avrai farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girato, delle belle tornando a riposo, ma ci settuatocino d'amor, delle belle tornando a riposo, ma ci settuatocino d'amor.
Next up is plugging in the ignition switch to the main harness. Next, I route the transponder antenna wire up to the front of the bike near the headlight, where it will be plugged in later. Now it's time to plug in the oil pressure switch. This sensor is located in the engine block, just beside the left cylinder. A simple but important connection, as this switch controls the oil pressure warning light on the dash. Next up is the alternator. I begin by fastening the positive cable to the side of the alternator. It's a tight spot to work in, but with a bit of patience and the right wrench, it goes on without too much trouble. Then, I plug in the 2-pin connector at the rear of the alternator. Now it's time to install and connect the crankshaft position sensor. This sensor is mounted directly into the engine block, just ahead of the left cylinder. If you're replacing the sensor, it's important to check the air gap to the trigger wheel on the crankshaft. This clearance must be within spec for the sensor to function properly. This is the component that tells the ECU exactly when the engine is rotating and where it is in the combustion cycle. It's absolutely critical for both ignition and fuel injection timing. It's also a common source of no-start issues on these engines. Let me know in the comments if you'd like a dedicated video on how to test and replace this sensor properly. Next, I bolt down the ignition switch. I've thrown out the original break-off anti-theft bolts and replaced them with regular hex socket bolts. Now it's time to install the ignition coils. It's the same procedure on both sides of the bike. I use new stainless steel bolts along with the original rubber mounts, which I've treated with Autoglum bumper care to keep them supple and fresh. Then, I give the connectors a good spray of acid-free dielectric grease before plugging everything in. Before we move on, a quick reminder. If you're enjoying this build and want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the little bell icon to get notified when new episodes go live. It doesn't cost you a thing. Subscribing is totally free, but it really helps support the channel and keeps projects like this going. So, if you want to follow the full rebuild and more Italian classics in the future, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Next up is mounting the front bracket that holds the headlight and instrument cluster. I install the 2 lower bolts that secure it to the lower triple clamp, but I don't fully tighten them yet. We'll come back to that later when everything is aligned. Then I move on to installing the horns. To get the positioning just right, I temporarily use the plastic side covers that will be mounted later. They help align everything properly. Once the horns are mounted, I plug in the electrical connectors. It's the same procedure on both sides, even though I only filmed one of them. Next up, refreshing more of the plastic and rubber parts with Autoglum Bumper Care. I have to say, I absolutely love this stuff. It's quick to apply, brings old materials back to life, and offers some protection against the elements. I go over various rubber mounts and plastic panels that are going back onto the bike soon, just to make sure everything looks clean and well kept once assembled. Installing the instrument cluster. I start by fitting new rubber mounts for the rear attachment points of the instrument panel. Once those are in place, I bolt the cluster down securely. Next, I press in fresh rubber bushings for the lower mounting point. This one will eventually attach to the headlight bracket. Then it's time to plug in the wiring harness. I apply a generous amount of acid-free dielectric grease to the connector. This one is especially sensitive. The pins are very small, and even the slightest bit of corrosion can lead to strange and hard-to-trace electrical issues. Once the connector is seated properly, there's one more connection to make. The ambient air temperature sensor lives inside the instrument cluster, and its plug needs to be routed and connected as well. Oh, and one more thing, I almost forgot this. The wire for the key transponder also needs to be plugged in at this stage. Finally, I make sure all the wiring is neatly tucked into place, ready for the upper cover to be installed. As you can see, I've previously made a custom top cover here to accommodate both an oil pressure gauge and an oil temperature gauge. The custom top cover is, just like the original, secured using 3 self-tapping screws from underneath. Once those are tightened down, the last step is to fasten the entire instrument panel assembly to the headlight bracket using one M6 bolt on each side, through the rubber bushings I installed earlier. Before tightening those bolts, I take a moment to tidy up the wiring around the panel and bundle everything neatly using small zip ties. And, as always, if you'd like to see how I designed and built this custom part, drop a comment below, and I'll consider making a dedicated video that shows the full process in detail. Next up, the front turn signals. Just like the rear ones, I've already prepped the wiring using the same method, soldered connections with heat shrink for protection. I've also designed and 3D printed custom adapters to mount these aftermarket indicators cleanly onto the headlight bracket. This way, everything fits perfectly and looks factory. I also installed the speed sensor, which is mounted on the rear of the swing arm. Next up, this piece of electronic spaghetti is my aftermarket Quickshifter unit. It's made by Tech, and while it might look intimidating at first, it's actually not that difficult to install. The Quickshifter works by momentarily cutting fuel to the injectors when you shift up, allowing you to change gears without using the clutch or backing off the throttle. The system is wired in series with the fuel injectors and also requires a 12V power supply. There's a small sensor that will eventually be mounted to the gear lever. but we'll get to that later in the series. I chose to mount the main unit near the fuse box, where there's plenty of room. I lay out the wiring harness and connect it between the stock injector plugs and the injectors themselves. Since these connectors are exposed to the elements and absolutely critical for engine operation, I use a generous amount of acid-free dielectric grease here. This unit also features Bluetooth connectivity and has its own app. Using the app, I can adjust how much pressure is required on the gear lever before the quickshifter activates, the RPM range in which it works, and how long the fuel cut lasts before blasting into the next gear. Next up, the main fuses. I positioned the two main fuses along with the quickshifter wiring. This is a small, separate section of the wiring harness that runs from the battery to the starter motor and also feeds power to the main harness through two fuses. These connectors are routed and plugged in on the right side of the airbox. I also connect the main power cable to the starter motor at this point. Finally, I install new fuses into the fuse box, including two spare ones, just in case. It's finally time to install the headlight, and the bike is really starting to look like a motorcycle again. I plug in the connector to the back of the headlight, then secure the unit using brand new stainless screws. Next up is finalizing the instrument cluster by installing the wiring and gauges for my custom oil pressure and oil temperature setup. I use a TIG welding rod to guide the wires cleanly through the custom instrument housing. Once the cables are routed, I secure the gauges using a 3D printed bezel that fits perfectly into the modified panel. Then, I install the original bezel over the stock instrument display. Now things are finally starting to look finished up front. Now it's time to hook up the wiring for the custom oil pressure and temperature gauges. I start by grounding the instruments at the main chassis ground point, located just behind the ignition switch. The temperature sensor is already mounted in the oil sump and ready to be wired up. As for the oil pressure sensor, I forgot to film the installation, but here are a few reference shots showing how I routed everything. There's not much room under the fuel tank, so I had to use a T-fitting at the original oil pressure switch and run a hose across to the other side to mount the pressure sensor securely. The signal wire for oil pressure is connected to the top of the sensor. The sensor also needs to be grounded to the engine for everything to work correctly. Next up is installing the main ECU, the true brain of this machine. This little box controls ignition, fuel injection, the instrument cluster, and pretty much the whole shebang. There are two large connectors here, each filled with a lot of tiny pins. And because these pins are so small and critical, making sure they're perfectly clean and well protected is absolutely essential. When I first got this bike, it actually came with several old ECU units, and all of them had one or more pins completely corroded away. Depending on which pin goes bad, the result can be anything from a non-functioning dash to a no-start condition. I've already cleaned the connectors thoroughly, and now I'm applying a generous amount of acid-free dielectric grease before plugging them in. There's also a ground wire that must be bolted directly to the ECU case. This one is really important. If it doesn't have good contact, all kinds of strange issues can occur. To be safe, I recommend checking the continuity of this ground wire with a multimeter before installing it. That way, you can be absolutely sure the wire is intact and well grounded through the harness. With the ECU securely installed and everything plugged in, it's time to mount the protective cover underneath it. Like all the other plastic parts on this bike, this cover has been treated with Autoglum bumper care to restore its original deep black finish and give it some added protection. I'm also doing a bit of prep work for the next episode, installing various rubber grommets and mounts here and there. And yes, all of those rubber bits have also been treated with, you guessed it, bumper care. And no, I'm absolutely not sponsored by Autoglym to say this. But hey, if anyone from Autoglym is watching, feel free to get in touch. I loosely mount the handlebars in place so we can begin fitting the switchgear and connecting it to the wiring harness. As always, I apply aluminum anti-seize paste to the threads. With the bars roughly positioned, I install the left side switch unit and plug it into the main harness. I've already opened up the switch housing, cleaned all the internals, and relubricated the moving parts to ensure everything works like new. But I can see this episode is starting to run a bit long, so I think it's a good place to wrap things up. And just to finish on a high voltage note, I couldn't resist installing the spark plug wires as a final touch to this electrifying episode. And that's it for this episode. We've tackled the entire wiring harness, installed the ECU, hooked up sensors, relays, and switchgear, and the bike is finally starting to look complete again. Next time, we'll dive into mounting the fuel tank, bleeding the brakes, fitting all the bodywork, and yes, actually finishing the rest of the bike. The next episode will be the last one in this build series. As always, if you're enjoying the build, please subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. It's totally free, and it really helps me keep the channel going. Thanks for watching. See you next time.